In this video, I discuss the first facet of a sociology of climate change: social causes or social drivers. What can sociology tell us about what it is about our society that can explain why we are emitting greenhouse gases in quantities large enough to change the Earth's climate? There are two places in sociology where we can begin to look for answers. The first is in what one might call a green updating of classical sociological theory. The second is in the work of my colleagues in the field of environmental sociology. Let's start with the green updating of classical sociological theory. The 19th century witnessed a dramatic transition in Europe, from an earlier type of society, feudalism, to the type of society we still live in today, urban industrial capitalism. This change from one type of society to a completely different type was immense and, in a sense, shocking. The thinkers whose ideas we study when we learn about classical sociological theory, intellectuals such as Emil Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, all witnessed this transition, and each, in his own way, asked pretty much the same questions about it. Feudalism had lasted hundreds of years. Why was it now failing? Why was it falling apart? And, even more important, what was this new society that was coming into existence? How do we describe it? How does it work? What are its strengths? What are its problems? One thing was obvious: that new society was incredibly dynamic, committed to growth, especially to economic growth. Consider, for example, this graph. It shows the total of the world's economic activity as measured by GDP, gross domestic product, over the past 2,000 years. Look at the difference before and after, say, 1750 or 1800. Before, largely flat. After, explosive rates of growth. The dynamism, the innovation, it was incredible. Even the theorist who was most skeptical about this new society, who literally hated it, had to express his admiration. Consider this famous passage from Marx's Communist Manifesto. In scarcely 100 years, more massive and more colossal productive forces than had been created in all preceding generations together. Machinery, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. It was amazing. At the same time, though, that new society was creating a host of conditions that no one had ever seen before. All those new factories were emitting immense plumes of smoke, blackening the skies above industrial cities. It looked like hell on earth. And in fact, the English mystic and poet William Blake explicitly evoked popular images of hell when he called these factories, quote, dark satanic mills. Some towns were rapidly growing into those industrial cities, but much of that growth was taking the form of slum urbanization, substandard housing, poor or non-existent sanitation, and so on. Working conditions inside the factories were simply awful. Dark, hot, stuffy, the air polluted, the shop floor crowded with dangerous machinery. Today, we would call these environmental problems. We understand now that a city is an environment, that workplaces are environments. But, at the time, in the writing of the classical theorists, these impacts were discussed primarily as social problems, as conditions that made people's lives worse. It wasn't until about the middle of the 20th century that most observers started to call such things environmental impacts. Once awareness of environmental impacts became widespread, some sociologists started to say that we should focus not just on people, but on society's relationship, its increasingly unsustainable relationship to nature. In other words, that we should green sociology, bring nature back into our discipline, into our research, into the stories that we tell. Greening classical theory was one part of this wider effort to get sociology to think about our relationship to nature. One way to think about greening classical theory is what is called re-narrating. To re-narrate is to tell the same story, but in a different way, in order to change its meaning or its emphasis. So the question was, can we re-narrate classical theory's story of the birth of modern society in a way that helps us explain why modern society has such dire environmental impacts and, more specifically, dire climate impacts? So how does one go about greening classical theory? How would one make it about the environment, about climate, not just about social problems? In the case of climate change, it turns out that doing this is actually pretty straightforward. Basically, all one has to do is to construct the causal chain that shows the linkages from economic growth to the growth of greenhouse gases. This explosion of economic growth was made possible by the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, on an ever-expanding scale. Burning fossil fuels, in turn, increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, and that increase in CO2 and other greenhouse gases was the physical driver of the rapid rise in atmospheric temperature. So, a green updating of classical theory does offer a clear answer to our question about social drivers of climate change. The main driver, industrial production, based on fossil fuel energy. Other ideas about social causes can be found in the works of environmental sociologists. They certainly agree that modern industrial production is a major driver, but they typically add other drivers as well, most often population and consumption. Population? Well, every person has needs. The more people there are, the more has to be produced to meet those needs, even if just their most basic needs. Consumption? It's not just how many people there are, it's also how much people consume. One of environmental sociologists' best known efforts to model how these drivers interact is this, the so-called IPAT equation. Here, environmental impact, I, is a product of some combination of population, affluence, that's a term that stands for the average amount of consumption per person, and technology, a term for the amount of environmental impact caused by each unit of consumption. In the case of climate, technology would be how much CO2 has to be emitted when making an item, and how much more is emitted when that item is used or consumed. There has been a lot of research using the IPAT equation. That research largely confirms that both population and average consumption are important drivers of environmental impacts. But we can go further. There are other subfields in sociology that analyze and explain why, for instance, population has been growing and why consumption has been increasing. In the case of population, that would be the field of demography. For consumption, the sociology of consumption. Although we don't have time here to go deeply into either of these fields, we can certainly point out why they matter for any full sociology of climate drivers. Let's take a quick look at population. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were about 1.5 billion people on Earth. At the end of the century, 6 billion. Population quadrupled in just 100 years. It increased by 4.5 billion. Such growth in human population clearly had to have had huge environmental impacts. Any attempt to explain climate drivers has to then explain why human population exploded in the modern age. One can find explanations for that growth in the work of demographers. By the way, today, in June of 2021, world population stands at 7.7 billion, an increase of almost 2 billion in just 20 years. Turning now to consumption, the first thing to observe is that, yes, population has grown, but consumption has grown faster. Clearly, it's not just more people. Average consumption per person has grown too. That too needs to be explained. It is a truism, but an accurate truism, that we live in a consumer society. Consumption is no longer just about satisfying basic needs. We are surrounded by advertising, urging us to consume more and more. We are told that buying things will make our life easier, that it'll make us more attractive, more popular, fulfilled, happy. We are taught that displaying to others the great stuff we have is the way to be admired, to achieve a higher status. No wonder average consumption per person keeps rising, at least in the middle and upper classes in advanced industrialized nations. The centrality of consuming in modern society has motivated the development of another subfield in sociology, the sociology of consumption, the study of what people consume, how much, and why. Again, it would take too long to delve into this literature, but we need to know that it exists, and it is relevant to any sociological explanation of climate drivers. Some of the findings in the sociology of consumption point us to yet another field of study in sociology that we need to consider: the study of social class inequalities, sometimes referred to using the term stratification. By social class, we mean inequalities of wealth and income in society. Almost all contemporary societies are deeply unequal on this dimension. A tiny minority have a lot of money, others less, and many have little or nothing. Let's take a look at some statistics on such inequalities in the United States. The top quintile, the top 20% of Americans, have about 83% of all the wealth in the nation. The rest, 80% of Americans, have what's left, about 17%. That's very unequal, but the situation is actually more extreme than that. The top 1% has about 42% of all the wealth. So, of that 83% going to the top quintile, half goes to the 1%, half goes to the rest, the next 19%. The top 1/10 of 1% has, just by itself, about 24% of the wealth, as you see here. Let's not forget, the bottom 80% has 17% of all the wealth. In other words, 4/5 of all Americans together have less, considerably less, than the top 1/10 of 1%. The bottom 40% has so little you can't even see it on this graph. And I should probably point out here that these figures are now a few years out of date. All the evidence suggests that these inequalities have only gotten worse in the past decade. Consider this graph, for example. It shows that the wealth of the 400 richest persons in the US, the Forbes 400, continued to grow between 2013 and 2020. And the wealth of the very top individuals simply exploded in the pandemic year from March 2020 to February 2021. Why does unequal distribution of wealth and income matter for climate change? The point is that environmental impact is not just a consequence of consumption in general or on average. How much or how little money a person has influences how much that person consumes and what they consume. And how much and what they consume determines the size of that person's carbon footprint. Let's consider just one example: a person's home. Wealthier people want and can afford to have bigger, nicer homes. Generally, a bigger house with more amenities uses more energy than a smaller, modest home. It needs more energy to heat it, to cool it, to keep it brightly lit, and so on. This 2020 analysis of household energy use shows that wealthier Americans have per capita footprints 25% higher than those of lower income residents, primarily due to larger homes. In especially affluent suburbs, these emissions can be 15 times higher than in nearby neighborhoods. And here is research that shows the big picture. Worldwide, the relationship between wealth and carbon emissions. In the 25 years from 1990 to 2015, the richest 1% were responsible for 15% of emissions. The top 10% was responsible for 52% of emissions. The bottom 50% was responsible for just 7%. So that's why we need to go beyond some measure of average consumption. Looking just at averages misses who really in society are the drivers of climate change. To summarize, sociological analysis offers real insights into what it is exactly about our society that has allowed it, over the past 2 centuries or so, to fundamentally transform the Earth's atmosphere. In the course of our discussion, we have added some new areas of sociology to our original 2: demography to understand population growth, the sociology of consumption, and the sociological study of inequalities or stratification. If you would like to learn more about how sociologists think about the drivers of climate change, you can go to this page of the website and click on the links highlighted here. In the next video, we move on to the second of our 3 inquiries: the impacts of climate change on society.